So briefly introduce Keti, who is the organizer of this entire event and our the founding mother of this conference. She holds a SSD from the philosophy department at Russian State University for the Humanities. Father. And is an associate professor at the Department of the Art History at the same University for Humanities, the head of the Theory and Research Department and at NCCA, the author of works on the anthropology of performativity, including the book To Be, to Perform, 2011. In her recent works had been focusing on the issues of ethics and aesthetics of the former socialism in the context of criticism of Soviet Marxism and humanism, member of the editorial board of the Moscow Art Magazine, author numerous texts, and her talk is called On the Ethics of the Non-Self. Welcome.
Thank you. We are really running out of our schedule, but probably it's a normal thing because we think and we debate and we discuss, and probably there's no big other who would control us, as I hope. But just continuing the debate and a rhetoric of Frank, whom I didn't ask the question because it would be really very long, I would say that I completely share his argument about impossibility and putting to question the term human. Only I would say that the concept of human and the conditions and existence of human already include the inhuman, already include this aporia, this impasse, this impossibility. So there's no need to add this in. And this has always been the question. I mean, this has always been the question of philosophy, that the human is already unnatural and we don't need to naturalize him and then add this little prefix to denaturalize him again. So this would be this very rhetorical and conceptual question. Also, my point would be that whether we talk about the humanist apologia, or the non-humanist, inhuman deconstruction, we still fall into the trap of still remaining Aristotelians. As I proceed with my paper, I will explain why. In his lectures of the 1972, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, when answering the rebuke from the audience about contemporary post-serialist music, which exceeds human perception and thus transcends art, answered that as the adept of radical enlightenment, he could imagine an evolutional gap between those who accelerated in their cognitive skills, spirit, intellect, and those who resided in the needs of reproduction, senses, just existence. So the gap between the unnatural overhumans or inhumans as against the natural humans. It is clear that this crypto-fascist standpoint is aimed at the further excellence of a human mind and cannot be identified with the notion of the inhuman as we debate it here, as it is posited in accelerationist theories, where inhuman becomes the machine of cognitive, creative emancipation, nor can this standpoint be compared with the idea of the inhuman as the capacity for the impossible, as it is stated by Frank. Even more so, it is separate from how inhuman is interpreted in cyber-feminism, speculative realism, or even psychoanalysis. But the common issue with all these very different edifices is still the agenda that tries to disavow the notion of the general and somehow keep the interpretation of this notion of the general as something monolithic, and then endow the human being with this value of general abstraction. And why I think that even the inhumanist debate remains to be Aristotelian is the following. It still juxtaposes human with something else, rather than what I would suggest is the dramatization of the relation and the intensity between the human and the human. So we never debate this the ethics and the gap between the human and the human, and we immediately construct the relation between the human and nature, human and the world, human and the unconscious, human and the inhumanist versatility of immanent world, human and God. And therefore, human remains to be a solitary creature. It remains to be something one. It remains to be entity. Or it remains to be some multiplicity where the same is concatenated with the same. And even when we come to psychoanalysis, the other, the Lacanian other, still is mirroring the subject. So this otherness of the man is already residing in the subject as human being, but it never happens that the subject is somehow being able to tear away from his or her selfness. So I would be talking about this capacity and possibility to tear away from the self. In other words, the rebuke is why should a human being know he is a human being and name oneself, whereas other creatures do not? And this is always the rebuke and the question, and this was the issue in Oksana's talk as well. So, and again, why should we reconstruct or invent this notion of the inhuman if we already have this extreme and excessive capacities within the human? So, as I already mentioned, to my mind, any defiance of a human being keeps to be Aristotelian because it relies on the set of attributes. So we cannot get away from those attributes that we, with which we endow the human being, and these equivalences that the human being is all the time performing and exerting and defining. The chief issue and the chief vicious circle here is, as I said, universality and generality. But could we think about the common and the general in different ways? Maybe the general can be something different than just a universal entity. And maybe it can be different than just abstract equivalent. And I would quote here the interpretation of the general by Evald Ilyenkov, who somehow tries to identify the human not with certain attributes, historically, biologically, anthropologically, but rather with this exertion of the generality, but then he tries to explain what is the general. And he claims that the human cannot exist without this dimension of the general. But the general is not the attribute. So the general is not the universality of truth, but it resides on the non-self being, on the loss of the self and the need for the other. The general or the common is not an entity understood as the principal invariant of cases and empirical phenomena. It is not a general attribute for the many. It presupposes being for the other, not only among human beings, but even among things as well. For example, two chairs are less general than a chair and a table together, or the reader and the book, or the employer and the employees. So that generality, commonality, is not just a universal attribute, is not trait distributed, but is rather a connection of two or more things brought together by their mutual lack and thus their mutual need. So generality connects to amplify one's lack in the other. And such an interpretation of the notion of the general definitely is based and influenced in the debate of Ilyenkov by Hegel's notion of несобственное бытие, non-self-being. Now, if we refer to Marx's definition of the generic in economic manuscripts, the generic as the main trait of the human, and hence the main condition of the upcoming communist society, is conditioned by the collapse of private property, and then Marx adds the withering of the self-interest. Foreclosing the potentiality of the generic dimension, private property makes a human being and a human society impossible. So the human is not the attribute, but a virtue and capacity of aspiring for the general. Therefore, I would suggest that not that we construct new possibilities or impossibilities to condition again what human is, but we'll check in various ethical, empirical behaviors of dying, of living, of performing, of attitude to the other, how this generality and hence humanness is performed. And thus human will not be substantiation of some attributes, but potentiality to make something by a man, not for himself, but for others, other men or creatures, so to posit oneself as the non-self. The question is why the dimension of the generic should be claimed on behalf of humans precisely and accomplished between the humans and not any contingent connection of anything with whatever or of human with whatever. Marx answers this question in the following way, because it is due to this bond between the humans that all other modes of alienation in nature, material world, could try or attempt to de-alienate. A human is generic and not reduced to the function of species being, because if animal forms the meta in accord with one's morphology and species being, a man can produce for the need of other species beings as well. So generic mode is in producing not for oneself, and be not for oneself, and implement this non-self being voluntarily. And Marx, of course, he has this idealist early period, and everyone would say that this is not reliable, but nevertheless he emphasizes the sensuous feature of such generality and of the social, saying that the social organs are formed dependent on the extent to which the feelings and enjoyments of the other people can become my enjoyment or my wealth as well. But along with absence of private property or evacuation of private property to exert this non-self ethics, it is crucial to position the value of labor So labor is something that makes something for the other. That's why labor is something that is by definition is the playground of the performing of the general. And proletarian, by the token of his deprivation, acquires the capacity to be non-self, since such capacity is facilitated by the absence of private property. And of course, the impoverishment of proletarian is not achieved as emancipation and is caused by labor division. Still, its absence functions as a starting point for the potentiality and performance of non-self being. Therefore, if we take as the starting point such an argument, then if we reject the general, it would imply that we reject the human, but also that we reject the poor. And if we reject all those things, then we de facto support private property and individualist solipsism. In other words, there is no need in being the human insofar as it resides in exerting certain attributes, but the human is a realization of diachronic social relations that are imprinted in labor, hence production, hence language and culture. And these are the things that are completely disavowed in psychoanalysis and speculative realism as some kind of vicious constructs, starting with Freud's discontent with culture and earlier with Freud's various discontents with human culture, language, etc. But if we take, for instance, Ilyenkov's Marxism, we shall see a completely converse attitude to language, culture, production, labor. And as he writes in his piece on the general, there is no sense in finding the common denominator of humanness between Christ, Neron, Mozart, Goebbels, Aristotle. The essence of human being is not abstract characteristic for each individual that would unite all of these at all. Rather, and he quotes Marx's thesis on Feuerbach here, it is more viable to think of a human as an ensemble of socio-historical relations. So a human being doesn't exist. It is just socio-historical relations. And these relations are embedded in labor and production. So it is not that there is a human species with attributes and then comes any sort of community which this individual is constructed. On the contrary, there is historicism, diachronicism, marked by living activity, the ensemble of historically developed means and ways of production and activity, and only after that comes the issue of human individual. But the reason why this term human is general and its generality is not at all a derogatory thing is that material world, everything that we touch, everything that is here, bears the imprint of such ensemble, bears the imprint of human, its activity, communication, and cannot be anything but human. In other words, culture and labor are here with us in every piece that is surrounding us. And they are inevitable. They come before any biological data or traits of humanness are established. They come even before any unconscious. Why? Because after we are born, what we face and confront is immediately things that are done by the others. This is language, labor, culture, because culture is nothing but something invented and made before me, apart from me, by others. So humans are those others who made it, and those objects and notions that I use, and thereby I owe them to them. I owe these things to them, to the others. And this mutual owing, mutual need and usage is nothing but human, also as long as it is general. So what I say, what I do, what I achieve is not my genetic inheritance, neither it is confined to creatures like my mama and papa, who gave birth to me, but they are generated by the long-run diachronics and a long-run activity and labor that made me. So I would disregard my father and mother and would rather open up the dimension of those people who are related to me into the open field, and this would somehow jeopardize what psychoanalysis could be within such argument. It is the diachronic and synchronic background of labor and social relations conditioned by the non-self being that construct the human and its generalness and not at all any essential traits. Ilyenkov defines the way the non-self being operates. It is the other determined non-self of any object when the being of anything can only be confirmed via other objects, beings, activities. And he gives just a nominalistic example how to operate with this issue of non-self being. The form of a jar, for instance, or a form of this cup, of anything. It emerges out of the hands of a potter, but it is neither a piece of clay, nor organism, nor body, nor physics of a potter as an individual, but it is molded by the drama, by diachronics and history of making objects by humans for the humans, and it is exactly this outward history and diachronic that makes the potter the transmitter of active forms of the societal activity. So on the one hand, this is pen, on the other hand, this is presence of all humans and of human culture. And this pen is humanist. It is humanist also because it is cultural, as long as object is created, used, needed due to the diachronic of the collective mind and collective human production. So there is impossibility of self-being without something's non-self-being, without being via the other, with the other, or for another. In other words, without the thing's other-determined non-self. Of course, had this issue of the non-self stood for the general and hence human being, had been only confined to production, its agenda would have just been evolution and technology. And another important issue here, along with labor, and a part of labor is private property, but of course, immediately poor life and deprivation, which becomes the checkpoint for the non-self ethics. It becomes some kind of a starting point for non-self ethics, and this is so, if we refer back to art, we shall see that this is a very important issue. The potentiality of the non-self is not possible in nature, it is completely unnatural. The human thus is general, but general not in the sense that every individual gets the attribute. What could make it general is the demolition of the limits between the self and non-self, between personal needs and the needs that are not my own. It is the forgetfulness of the self without any sublime or pathetic reason, some kind of self-amnesia, or another term used by a Soviet aesthetician, Mikhail Lifshitz, human resignation. And I will quickly touch upon this poor life issue and then show a very funny extract from Pasolini. Dispossession of a proletariat de facto brings the freed room of non-self being as not only the self but also as non-self, because many conditions constructing the self, possession, individual pleasures, interests, fears, traumas, achievements are not implementable. And art, literature, philosophy use this condition of deprivation. Some rebuke such works in Pauperism. We know the rebuke of Bernardo Bifo to Pasolini for pauperism. Nevertheless, it's no surprise that Marx also starts from the same place. Proletarian's dispossession, the way it could have been exerted in non-capitalist society. Proletarian's dispossession, of course, is different from the way this dispossession and evacuation of private property could be implemented in non-capitalist society, but still poverty ethically allows to check this issue between self-interest and non-interest. And self-interest and non-self-interest. And this is exactly why so many radical plots and characters of such plots exert the dilemma between self-survival conditioned by poverty and non-self being performed artificially and artistically. And we know these plots and characters in them which exactly develop in conditions of harsh poverty and act out, perform this non-self ethics when it is almost impossible to do so. We can name Pasolini, Mama Roma, Catone. We can name Brecht's characters, Schende, Gruchet, Ioana of the Schlachthofe. We can name Platonov's characters, Chagataev, and other protagonists. And of course, such poverty should not be aestheticized. It doesn't guarantee the ethics of self-recession or self-resignation. It just reveals the non-self ethics in the regime of performative choice. And I would make a little addition here. Such ethics is exerted not because human is something, a set of virtuous attributes that we have to exemplify or stick to, but exactly because it is almost nothing, has no virtue. Human being is not attractive. Other beings, other creatures in nature is much more attractive, much more enjoyable. No surprise that we want so much to dispense with the human in favor of dissipation in this glittering aleatoric hybridity of anything with anything, or we want to imagine and acquire the sovereignty of animal, or we want to acquire the excellence of a machine. Nevertheless, this issue of this very poor, squalor conditioned human being is still there, exactly in this drama and ethics of one against the other, of the self against the non-self. And I would now show a little passage from Teorema, from Pasolini. It's interesting how he uses this framework of voluntary loss of the self, which entails resignation, but also resignation of property. This episode I will show, it's not only about it not only unravels the bond with poor life, but also it, to my mind, undermines the logic of psychoanalysis, and it undermines this mythic plot of Oedipus on which psychoanalysis resides in its libidinal obsession with the self, and this self-oriented rhetoric is definitely libidinal, and this little passage is amazing for me because it shows destroys it. So I will quickly say the plot. Everyone knows this plot, but it's like a strange guest appears in the mansion of bourgeois family. He seduces sexually almost all members of the family, and including the maid, which is in this scene. So this is the series of seduction of all members of the family, and this maid tries to attract his attention. He doesn't pay attention to her. Then she runs around. He notices this. Then he comes to the kitchen to somehow pretend that she's committing suicide because she's seized by this lust and desire. And then he comes to her and somehow saturates her longing. But what is interesting here is the text of Pasolini, and the text is something that, is not articulated in the film. The text is absolutely fantastic. This is how Pasolini himself describes this scene. The calm patience of the guest are kindly ironic, as if the mad and extravagant behavior of Emilia, the maid, her weakness, inability to resist temptation, her loss of dignity, in other words, turnover in the world where everything seemed simple and clear, as if all this caused in him nothing but only benevolent empathy. Nothing but motherly tenderness. Such attitude, such expression of eyes, which say, and this is characteristics of the guest, so what? Don't be upset, never mind, become more evident when Emilia, flattered by kindness and entirely in the grip of her instinct, mechanically, in some rather mystical than hysterical ecstasis, raises her skirt. In what other way, having been rid of language and consciousness, having lost shame, could she open and suggest herself? Nothing but the purity and the animal devotion is left. As if cherishing her shame, which she ignored and which for her has always been everything, with the former motherly care and tender irony, the guest draws the skirt down and strokes her face. Emilia cries of shame. These are not the child's tears, which relieve the soul because the trouble is over. He wipes her eyes with the awe and obeisance of a dog, or the loving daughter. She kisses his fingers. Yielding to her desire, the guest lies over her. So a very subtle point here is the weird mutation between libidinal and non-libidinal, of drive and grace, of desire and mercy, of shame, of squalor, and of benevolence. And Pasolini uses this word, benevolent empathy. And the question is, what kind of motherly tenderness can at all be implied in a person who arouses in character sexual desire? How can it be that he feels himself a mother, exerts the care of a mother, and at the same time submits himself to somebody's irresistible lust for him? Playing the libidinal role of a lover and getting involved in the sexual intercourse, he nevertheless emanates anything but drive, anything but sexually marked desire. And to repeat again, as Pasolini writes, the guest experiences nothing but motherly tenderness, care and consolation for the maid seized by desire, but yielding to her drive, he himself experiences only benevolent empathy, which presupposes recession of the self. So this paradoxical motherly benevolence exerted by a human being, regardless of gender, is in yielding to the irresistible sexual desire of some sort of a child who aspires for the role of lover, while the guest observes this desiring child benevolently as mother. The motherly here is also in concealing one's motherly stance, allowing the other to use oneself sexually but conceal benevolently one's being beyond desire, while yielding to the other's desire. This is what constructs actually disinterested, benevolent empathy, as if Iocaste knew that the person who appeared at Thebes is her son, but deliberately played the role of a wife and allowed this to happen from her perspective of a mother out of some mischievous and subversive delibidinized benevolence. This is exactly the potentiality that Freud maybe disregards, namely performance of the other's interest, which as a result transforms the other's interested as a consequence. And in the script, if we see what happens to those characters, which are first in the lust, in the longing, then undergo this grip of desire, we shall see that they start to exert this self-resignation themselves. So as if they get contaminated or invaded by this issue of the other's interest, by this performance of benevolence. On the one hand, being obsessed by libidinal desire, she cannot resist it. But as soon as the non-desiring guest, with his benevolence, yields to her desire, she also witnesses this double bind of sexual involvement, on the one hand, and shame that he cannot experience nothing but desire. So this benevolent, non-libidinal, even condescending empathy to human desire transforms the desire of the maid, recoding it into something else. And I think it has nothing to do with sublimation. It rather deals with undermining the issue of libidinality. And actually, I think that this non-libidinal consequence is there even in the myth of Oedipus at the end, implemented after the blinding of Oedipus. But it is probably very important that to construct and to build on the edifice of psychoanalysis, Freud chooses exactly the myth of Oedipus, which starts from the self-interests, when Laius prefers to get rid of the child to evade prophecy, not to be killed. So he chooses his own safety and safety of his kingdom. And this myth is about self-preservation. Meanwhile, there are other myths which are exerting exactly the resignatory acts, non-libidinal acts, which are forcing the libidinality to collapse. Antigone rejects her affair with Hippolyte and prefers self-recession in the name of certain type of care that exceeds self-preservation. Or Medea, when her position of a mother and a wife is destroyed by libidinal desire of Jason, exterminates the position of a mother since it failed to compete with the libidinal one. Or even Orpheus, after returning from Hades without Eurydice, becomes a solitary singer but completely united in the general universe. So these myths are about the gap between desire, between drive, and the self-resigning eros. And this is what happens in the film, in Theorema as such, with each character which undergoes this checkpoint of desire. They get thwarted from the realm of lust and voluntarily start to initiate self-deprivation. The owner of the factory gives it away, ends up naked in the desert. The daughter collapses in catatonic fit. The maid mentioned above stops to eat, and villagers believe she becomes a saint. And in the end, she voluntarily, you know how it ends, she voluntarily terminates to live. So in the end, all characters hitherto seized by desire acquire the capacity of benevolent self-resignation. This way is not an aestheticized empathy, but it is inevitable as long as any poor life happens to exist, and until it exists, and there is no other checkpoint of the generic and the general as such. I would end by saying that the issue of humanism, for me, is not about reclaiming the human as the inhuman, as against the human, but rather becoming the other human. Because I find most of non-post, anti, or even inhumanisms some sort of metaphors of quasi-religious or quasi-theological externality, the metaphors of the beyond that we want to acquire and search for, whether this beyond is already within. But also one of the most important things in the self-ethics as against the non-self-ethics is the preoccupation and obsession with the sovereignty. And that's why we want to be angels, animals, which are sovereign, rather than humans, which are not. Thank you.
And relating to the event, this is the interesting thing that not many people know, that Pasolini speaks of the guest at times as Dionysus, Jehovah, so it's religious, but at times he calls it an event. And my understanding of the film is that it's a proto-Badiousian film, in a sense. Dionysus or Jehovah, so he says it could be a god, whatever, or the event. Yes, like l'événement. L'evento. So there is something special about Emilia, but then there is the theorem of the title. And Pasolini says very clearly, there is one hypothesis in this film, and it's the following. What would happen if a guest, the event, Jehovah, Dionysus, were to visit a liberal bourgeois family right now, 66? And the answer to that question for Pasolini is the bourgeoisie, especially when it is liberal, is unredeemable. So I see how there is like something special about Emilia. Emilia comes from Emilia-Romagna, so it's like a very peasant, it was at that time, region. But I don't quite see how you actually see the other characters dealing positively with the event, because Pasolini is very clear. I mean, they all fail, even Paolo, the father, who gives away the factory. And he says very specifically, they all fail because they are bourgeois, hence the liberal bourgeoisie is unredeemable, because they want to repeat the event. They treat the event, the guest, as a personal experience out of moral guilt, he says, instead of a communal experience. And then the episode you mentioned is very important, the beginning of the film. So the very beginning of the film, the episode you mentioned, so you have the factory workers that are interviewed in a kind of pseudo-documentary fashion, and they're asked, so what will you do now that your boss gave you the factory? And they say basically, oh, I don't know. You know, it's like, the idea there is that he made this gift out of guilt, and he didn't actually decide to manage the factory with the workers. So my question for you would be the following, I mean, because you seem to have like a more optimistic take on all the characters' reaction to the event. Because I think like what Pasolini wanted to say is in a Badiousian sense that only, and then there's another story, why Emilia, why the peasant woman. But in a sense I read it as a very Badiousian film. It is to say events do happen and we can either be faithful or not faithful to events. And Pasolini, radically anti-humanist in a sense, thesis is that the bourgeoisie, qua bourgeoisie, especially when liberal, cannot be faithful to the event, full stop.
It's like, this argument I completely share. I wouldn't say that this is some kind of, just attachment to this guest as the angel liberates them from their guilt of being inscribed in this bourgeois production. Rather, I would say that it claims and asserts the issue of the evacuation of privacy and of the private, and it ethically positions it as the starting point. So this end when the human being, whether he is redeemed or not, because he's a bourgeois and his sins will never be redeemed, he ends up as a naked person in the desert, and this is probably the metaphor of a bourgeois of alienation rather than any redeemed position and any positive or optimistic potentiality of the future production. But still, this deprivation is there. The act of deprivation, although it is unredeemable, is very important, and it's like the ritual of deprivation.
No, he says, like, literally, the interviews, like Pasolini says, it's about the voiding of bourgeois identity.
Excuse me?
The voiding of bourgeois identity. So even like the nakedness of the former factory owner running naked in the desert, it's like he no longer believes in his identity. So I share this point of view. You know, it's a form of evacuation. Pasolini says voiding a lot of times in the novel. But then there is a condemnation, which is also very problematic because, you know, like in a sense, if you identify as bourgeois or proto-bourgeois or anti-bourgeois, you're already unredeemable in a sense.
Okay, thank you, Keti, for this. I have a question about the first part of your paper when you said, when you introduced the claim about, let's say, language, culture, and labor preceding the human in some sense, right?
No, constructing the human, because there is
okay.
no
But if-
proceeding, but
Yes,
as long
okay.
as, well, it cannot be separated.
Yeah, okay. But, I mean, how would you, I mean, if this is the case, language, culture, and labor constructing the human, are language, culture, and structure human? If not, they're anonymous, and then you make a, I mean, quite.
I think language, labor, and culture are human.
Okay, so the human constructs the human. The human precedes its own construction. This is what you're saying then.
Why? There's no precision.
Because that from which something...
there is nothing antecedent to it. I mean, human is constructed by, because there's no solitary human. We always think that there is some kind of initial human as against whom there is labor, language. There is no solitary human. There is no solitary subject separated from the process of activity. So there has never been any solitary human as the origin, as we see in the Holy Bible or the Holy, yeah. So you cannot say that first there is an individual and then there had been some kind of labor activity, communication, and etc.
No, but I mean, okay, let's use traditional language. Then this would be a performative idea of what the human is, right? The human is embedded in his practices and becomes a human through what he does. But thereby you already somehow invest the human. You're saying the human is what it is through what it does. And thereby you're already sure that there is a human, right? Or aren't you?
You know, these practices are the practices between one human and another human. And this is what is essential there and important. This is the in-between practices. These are collective practices. And this collectivity makes it human. So it's not that labor as such, the notion of something produced is human, but the capacity to do for the other and between the other.
This is Hannah Arendt,
yeah.
basically.
So everything is very persuasive and beautiful, but if it is true that there is some kind of priority of non-self and that we are that humans are only possible as a connection with the other, which is all persuasive, it's even not even Hannah Arendt, it's kind of Levinas.
But it's Marx,
Yes,
early Marx.
I'm not so sure. The question is, why is there an ethical conclusion that you make? Because it could be completely the opposite.
Ethical conclusion of?
Why do you choose this this particular conclusion? Because you could say that yes, because we live in a very impersonal, unpersonal world, the task is to individuate. This is because if you are born as an individual, then you may have an ethic of being non-self. This is Levinas, and this is a bourgeois ethic. While if you have an ontology that is the ontology of the common, then the ethic is precisely the opposite, to individuate. This is the answer of people like Simondon or Virno. Of course, individuation doesn't mean to become a sovereign subject, because that would be an illusion. But something like an assemblage, or I don't know, a Deleuzean machine. So you would have some kind of combination of self and non-self, and these self and non-self would form some kind of stable couple that would, you would basically have to marry an object outside you or another person, etc., and together build a subject. But not dissolve yourself in this non-self, in this improper world, because that would be some kind of mystical sansara, nirvana thing. Yeah.
Oh, very good question, and I got it. So the Deleuzean point also would be that there is some singularity, and then there is some kind of series and contingent flows and clashy flows of other singularities, and there is some kind of outcomes and burst outs of eventuality, and this is the bond of this is the contingent bond of the self with whatever. But what is meant in Ilyenkov's sociology, he doesn't disregard the individual. He's not saying that individual should be completely erased and dismissed. What he says is that I cannot be the individual as some kind of genealogy of my psychics, genealogy of my reference to the family, but my genealogy is incommensurable. As incommensurable as the historical long run of humankind, because ну оно как бы необъятное, как сказать, ungraspable, yeah, необозримое, да, because I mean there's one very pathetic example. Exactly from the psychologists with whom Ilyenkov worked, namely Leontiev and Meshcherikov. They worked with the dumb and mute children, which actually, it's the question whether they are human or not, whether they can exert those impossible acts of any love or of any political act, because they are born not hearing and not seeing, and they are just creatures which cannot exert this. They have no language. But nevertheless, a very complicated activity of pedagogy achieved that quite a number of these people, and quite many of them, became even scholars, being dumb and deaf. And one deaf, deaf. And one of them, there's a very famous example, one of them being deaf and blind, which became a PhD in social sciences, Alexander Suvorov. He was asked a question when he was holding speech or quasi-speech at the university, and the question was that how is this that we know that human senses are completely dependent on thinking and intellect, and if the capacity of senses is collapsing, it's not possible to develop the cognitive capacities. And how is it that you cannot hear, you cannot see, and still you are so intelligent? And he said, I can see and I can hear. I can see and hear with your eyes and with your ears. So this would be my answer.
About specificity, because about this, my question would be maybe because thank you for this interesting paper. I just wanted to clarify something. What you said about how human is produced, how it is somehow produced from this supra-individual dimension of what you call general. Is it actually allgemeine or general? Is it allgemeine in German, like in Hegel, or general in Lienkov? Or it's common, like in other discourse?
I think allgemeine.
Allgemeine.
Всеобщее, да, нет, всеобщее. Это
Gemeine. Gemeine.
No. Yeah, but you know, there's a big debate how to translate this всеобщее back to English. It's translated as universal, but I would not translate it as universal.
Yes, rather universal.
But it's translated as universal, but I would translate it as general. This is the issue.
This was my question. Yes. But just for about specificity, because I was thinking about what is general, because I read some of your text, and general against the common. You somehow so if you produce a term, you need probably to explain more through this translation or mistranslation or somehow. And another so I think about also another thing. For example, the same Lifshitz or Ilyenkov you quote, they actually were. I'm not probably my knowledge of Lifshitz and Ilyenkov is not so so big, but I mean that they were very skeptical to this humanist discourse actually. And Ilyenkov and Lifshitz. So for them, this current of 60s, when also was quite international, this discovery of early Marx and this what was also sort of Marxism as a humanism, it was a sort of general international. But they were quite skeptical because Lifshitz, generally, he was very interesting thinker in terms that he is very sort of ironical. He has very ironical style, very sarcastic style, and he said when these people who are just Philistines, they started to say about the humanity. He says, for example, one interesting joke that I've read in the book that about Dostoevsky, that resurrection of the dead. It was one as a topic of Fedorov, this another obscure Russian thinker, is a humanism. Yeah? Resurrection of the dead is a humanism.
My point is not to talk about human at all. Again, I started from this, that there is no necessity to define humanism and assert humanism as some kind of, I don't know, attribute to human society. I rather would say that the issue is the constellation between, right? And for Ilyenkov, the issue of the general, I gave a very mathematically and logically precise example how he tries to define it as the non-self-existence of anything. Yeah, the general is thus interdependence of things when they lack each other, and when this lack is not self-sufficient. So it's some kind of philosophy of anti-self-sufficiency, of anti-self-referentiality. And this makes the context general. And human is some kind of, I don't know, consequence rather than the initial, it's not a value. I mean, human is not a virtue. Humanism is not a virtue, and it's not a value.
So somehow it's sort of subsequent or derivative concept from the general in your
I think
view.
so.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay, now it's more clear.
One more, two more questions. One, does it work or? Yes. Right. As far as I understand, your conception is so. There are humans and humans. So there is one human and another human, and if we somehow get rid of the supplement of the libidinal, this will allow us potentially to open up a certain horizon of or a certain collective dimension of sexual desire, right? And what I'm puzzled by the question is what to do in this case. What to do with the God, with religion? Who is the first jealous, as Frank said, the first jealous individual, and jealous, and
who is
the first jealousy and the first sovereign subject, and etc., etc. Because the libidinal supplement is not only bourgeois and it's not only capitalist. But it's also Christian. So what to do with the Christianity and this Marxist in this Marxist perspective?
Yeah, a good question. Well, I think what Marx is saying, and what is really important here, and what democratic criticism is all the time dismissing as authoritarian, is exactly this point. Why should there be such a friendship between only humans? Is this not some sort of elitism and already some sort of limitation? But I think the issue here is not that I like other humans and let's be friends. No, the issue here is that exactly what Frank started with, that I am almost nothing, right? And despite the other is almost nothing, there is some kind of little remainder of benevolence, as in this film, little remainder that will be the residue for the impossible relation. So the other human being is nasty as well as I'm nasty. So we are initially jealous. We are fucking shitty, nasty, stinking, greedy, self-preoccupied, etc. So nobody is saying that this is not the case. But again, why I like this impossibility argument is that instead of the desiring the other for myself, which is the issue of libidinality, yeah? I desire the object and obliquely I desire myself. The issue is to lose oneself. And this is the ritual.
Thanks so much for the discussion. I think I understand this now much better than before. But would you say, okay, a very short two-sentence question. Would you say, I think I get your position now much better than before, but the getting rid of oneself, it sounds like the ethics you propose is a sacrificial ethics. And I mean, in sacrifice, there is always libidinal investment, right? I mean, one gets quite high
yeah,
on.
From the point of view of psychoanalysis, yes, but I would not. Yes, definitely. Even Lyotard is right that the saint is the prostitute. This is some kind of sublimation of your. I wouldn't agree. It's a long argument, but I would say that there is capacity for the non-libidinal practice. And this is very important, and I would rather search for them to find out how they are implemented.
But then, I mean, this clarifies a lot, but I think we go back to Artemis' question, because otherwise, you know, like, how do you avoid a critique of a certain Western rational understanding of samsara, nirvana, etc., etc.? I mean, you have to, at that point, you have to, if the objective, ethical objective, is in a way delibidinalization, right? If I understood it correct, delibidinalization. So in a way, what you are close to ethically is a samsara nirvanic position, which was.
Why?
But how do you distinct? I mean, a sort of loss, a sort of like active ethical promotion of the voiding of oneself, to go back to the film, which is then not aimed at a different form of libidinal economy, let's put it like that, it leaves you very few options. So you have to actually show how it is not a kind of nirvanization.
No, nirvanization is dispensing with any contact, it's dispensing with sexuality, it is dispensing with bodies, but I'm not talking about dispensing of contact, love, tragedy, clash, contradiction, pain. No, this nirvanic issue is just neutralizing all contradictions and controversies.
This clarifies again. But then,
but I would say, well, I had a previous research. I would say that this is the relationship which resides not in surplus element, and libidinality is the surplus element, but in use element, taken as necessity.
Given that you were so critical of psychoanalysis, then the further question is to, I think, show how you.
What?
Sorry?
If
you are critical, I will talk more slowly. If you are critical of psychoanalysis, and that was your polemical tone throughout the paper, and on the one hand, you are not seeking for an Oedipal libidinal economy, on the other hand, you're not looking for an urbanization, as you just clarified, then the further question would be, why not anti-Oedipus? I mean, how does it differ from Deleuze and Guattari's position?
Because Deleuze is important, I think, here, because Deleuze is the one who disregards father and mother. He says Oedipus is just, he's an orphan, and it's just a big fake of Freud. He never had mother and father. Actually, mother was his wife, father was his rival, sexual rival, and he didn't know that. So he's an orphan, and let him remain orphan ever. And let him be dissipated in this dissipated world of molecular multiplicities and whatever. But what is important for Deleuze is not to is to extrapolate the unconscious. So he de-psychoanalyzes unconscious, but he by the same token he extrapolates unconscious on any practices, and then by this act he Buddhizes the drama, the contradiction. He de-dramatizes the confrontation between one and the other. Between the self and the non-self. He doesn't have that because, I mean, my extension can be the fish, my extension can be the tool, my extension can be anything. It's not the issue. He's the radical counter. He's the radical transhumanist in this way, right? So he.
So you support that position?
I don't support that position. Of course not. No.
Yeah,
no, I want tragedy.